Yes, I think we are set. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the April Faber Sessions, the day after Easter Sunday. Hope you all had a wonderful Easter weekend. And just because Easter was yesterday, of course, does not mean that Easter is over, but we are now in the Easter season. And so I hope that that is a time, this is a rich time for you the next few weeks as we're remaining in this time of the Christian calendar. It's so great to have you all here from wherever it is you're calling in from, whether there's feet of snow on the ground or whether you're down south where it's already feeling like summertime. It's just great to have you here. Thanks for joining on this day after a holiday. I'm going to keep everyone muted for the most part, as usual. There will be times when Rick will open our time to conversation. At that point, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand or indicate you have something to say. We'll bring you in. But I know it's going to be a wonderful time of listening to and reading poetry together, and then being able to discuss and have conversation around the poetry of Emily Dickinson. So thanks again for being here, and we'll get going with Father Ganz.
Thank you, Mary. Welcome everybody on Easter Monday, which I learned today from somebody is called Dingus Day. In Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, they have a whole tradition around Easter Monday, and what you do on such a day is that Dyngus. You'll have to look it up. It's kind of a playful sort of feast day right after Easter. And Mary's right that one of the things we hope for from eternity is that when we have profound experiences, especially of connection with people that really matter to us, and we just feel the connection such that time just flies and you don't notice that it's gone. Think of a great dinner party and everyone is just really getting along. And it's just before you know it, it's like 10:30 at night and you started, at 6 o'clock. Whereas if you were doing taxes starting at 6 and you were still doing them at 10, it would have seemed like 2 years of labor. So one of the things we hope for from eternity is that these experiences of abiding and connection and openness of being would just go on and on. They wouldn't have to stop. I mean, we have to go home now, we have to leave now, or something interrupts and it just sort of, we say, breaks the spell. And then it's over and we feel like we fell back into time. Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Well, on the Christian or Catholic liturgical calendar, around the seasons of Christmas and around the season of Easter, we play with time. We deliberately work to do something different with time itself. And so in order to get ready for Advent, we have 4 weeks of preparation to actually get free enough, deep enough, still enough, into which the divine gift can come. As was said by William James somewhere, the great brother of Henry James, the novelist, William James, a great American pragmatic philosopher. He said, the profoundness of a moment is conditioned profoundly by the amount of silence that precedes the moment and the amount of silence that follows it. Easter is prepared for over the 40 days of Lent, so that we're available to receive the day of Easter, which lasts 8 days long. See how we're playing with time and distorting it? So the readings at the daily Eucharist are all from that day, when dawn arises and he is resurrected and all that starts to happen. And all the stories are read throughout the 8 days of Easter. So it's as if Easter, what we call Easter Sunday, lasted for 8 days. There's that distortion, that playing with time. so that we stay inside the grace. I don't want to leave here. Okay? But the octave, as we call it, of Easter, creating that single day of Easter, is also contained within what is called Easter tide. That's what Mary referred to. 7, and the formula is 7 times 7 plus 1. So 7 times 7 weeks is 49 days. And the 50th day, which in Greek is Pentecost, is the Feast of Pentecost and the descent of the Holy Spirit and the beginning, if you will, of ordinary time, empowered by the Holy Spirit that Jesus promised would be sent to us. So as soon as Easter has completed the Easter Sunday, we enter that larger thing called Easter tide, 7 times 7 weeks plus 1 day. Let us pray. Taken from Psalm 16. I bless the Lord who counsels me. Even in the night, my heart exhorts me. I set the Lord ever before me, with him at my right hand. I shall not be disturbed. Therefore, my heart is glad, and my soul rejoices. My body too abides in confidence. Because you will not abandon my soul to the nether world, nor will you suffer your faithful one to undergo corruption. Gracious Lord, in this Easter tide, within the octave of Easter, open us to allow a great poet to enter. And through her skill with words and fierceness of life and scary, deft perception, make us sharper, more perceptive about all that has unfolded in Jerusalem and then even into Galilee before you were taken up into heaven. We offer this evening to you. Amen. Oh my, Emily Dickinson. I'd like to come at this by setting her in a frame, a historical frame, so you can kind of go, oh, so that's, oh, I see. She's working about the time as this. Oh, so that's when that was happening. That's the setting in which she was moving and having her thoughts and writing her poems. So let me start by giving you just a basic timeline of what we call the American experiment. The American continent was settled in the 1600s and up to 1763. 1763 will put us 1 century away from the middle of Emily Dickinson's life. During the time of the colonial settlement of America, 1600s to 1763, George Herbert is working in England, and over the course of the last 3 years of his life, as he was dying of tuberculosis, the colonies were being founded by England and France. George Herbert, who lived from 1593 to 1633. We saw him previously. William Shakespeare lived from 1564 to 1616. So about the time that the American experiment was starting and colonists were coming across the water, I think 1620 is we think of as the time of the Mayflower and the Pilgrims, that kind of thing. William Shakespeare was alive and working. He died in 1616. The next major section of American history after the colonization was the American Revolution, which is a larger category than just the Revolutionary War. So the American Revolution was from 1763 to 1783, 20 years. So it was all the steps that were taken by the colonists who were connected to both France and England, whom both France and England tried to exercise their control over what was happening in the New World. And all of the turbulence and complexity that was going on, as eventually the colonists felt compelled to fight for their release from foreign control. So it was a 20-year process. So from the 1600s to 1763, the first colonists arriving. From 1763 to 1783, those colonists start establishing their independence because there's a huge body of water that separates from those that they used to belong to, who are trying to exercise a control from such a great distance. The next period, starting in 1783, can be called the new nation. It's starting to gain an identity. Instead of being, I'm from England, or what part of England, I'm from France, or from where, what section of France, people were starting to talk about us as Americans. I don't know when the word American first started being used. That I don't know. That's interesting. I'll have to look that up. But anyway, the new nation, they recognize themselves as a something distinct, not just independent. That's one thing, but to be distinct and aware of your identity is another thing, a further thing, a maturing. That's from 1783 to 1815. Now we're starting to get very close to the birth of Emily Dickinson, who was born in 1830. So the new nation is really new, is what I'm saying. During that time of identity, the War of 1812 and all of that finished in 1815. Remember Napoleon, the French Revolution has happened, all that difficult stuff on the European continent that would have an effect in America. From 1815 to 1880, which plops us right into the middle of Emily Dickinson's life. It includes most of her life, is called national expansion and reform. It doesn't take you long to remember that part of the reform that had to happen was going to be related to slavery and all of that stuff. It was during this time that the political power of President Andrew Jackson, which became the Democratic Party, was the party of slavery. That kind of surprises us in our present use of these terms. And it was the growing, what they called Whigs, using an old country language, who were the liberals, who began to be very uncomfortable with slavery as an institution, about the inability of women to vote. That was a perturbation in that group. So you started to see a two-party system starting to emerge. In other words, in order to have a genuine union, you have to have difference. Otherwise, it's not a union, it's just uniformity. Everyone's the same. So unity is a greater thing than uniformity. Uniformity is the control of a dominant ideology or a dominant person to make everyone do it exactly the way they say. They can compel. Uniformity is a human error and constant temptation. Unity is a spiritual event that can only happen in real relationship, when people are really different and have learned how to relate to each other. That's a harder, more mature thing. We're missing some maturity these days, but that's another story. So anyway, I bounce right along. Next, Abraham Lincoln, who was a Whig, part of the liberal branch, if you will, and eventually became the Republicans. He had his presidency from 1860 to 1864. And of course, he had a complex thing to deal with in the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. So with Emily Dickinson, who was born in 1830 and who would die in 1886, you're beginning to see that her life was lived in the time of national expansion. So the world was getting bigger. The American world was getting bigger as the movement out west and the nation started buying up big chunks, the Louisiana Purchase, the Gadsden Purchase, these things we learned about in grade school, to create a continent, the American boundaries. All of that was happening, and such expansion also includes encounter with other nations. We call them First Nations. And so different ways of thinking and different ways of living are starting to enter the national consciousness. A lot has to change because it's such a different place than the way it was back in our village in England. The American Civil War happened right in the center of Emily Dickinson's life. She lived in Amherst, Massachusetts, so she was in the north and far from the border where so much fighting took place, far from battlefields. But that's what was happening all around her. Finally, from 1865 to 1877, this last part of Emily Dickinson's life was the period of Reconstruction, which, if we look at someone like Frederick Douglass, who saw and was a close friend of Abraham Lincoln, we've seen about him before, there was a lot of destruction in Reconstruction. It didn't work. So the great hope, the great battle for equality of Black people was not achieved. The South continued to be violently opposed to the integration of Black people into the nation. So there was tremendous conflict, and to be honest, it just didn't work. Reconstruction, all that was fought for, all the blood that was spilled, had a few gains, but we still don't have the gains that the Civil War fought for. We're still not quite there. What was won was, at least in big parts of the country, the emancipation of slaves, the growing emancipation of women and giving them voting rights, and voting rights for Black people. Those were genuine gains. One of Emily Dickinson's closest friends was a Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was 7 years her senior. She was very affected by him. She ran across him and started a correspondence with him. He was a white man who was very committed to temperance, women's rights, labor, and against slavery. He was the very first commander of an all-Black brigade of soldiers in the history of this country, the South Carolina Volunteers, the 33rd U.S. Colored Troops, as they called them. And he was the first commander of that Black regiment. He was the one credited with, quote, discovering Emily Dickinson and her enormous capacity as a poet. And he encouraged her to trust that. The last part I'll mention before we start hearing her poetry is from 1876 to 1900 is the rise of industrial America, a movement away from land and animals, establishing a relationship with the natural world that had been so much a part of the American mindset. Think of Ralph Waldo Emerson, another key influence on Emily's life. Independence, living close to nature, learning the ways of nature and being in sync with it was very much a part of the American consciousness that lived in wilderness as it moved out west. So now with the rise of industrial America, we no longer have to relate to the natural world, we exploit it. And instead of having animals, we have machines. And it has a big effect on the consciousness of America. These are generalizations, and I have to be generalizing in order to create a sense of a kind of trajectory in the American consciousness that Emily Dickinson noticed. Okay, one last thing. At the time Emily Dickinson was writing, her contemporaries in the American literary scene are these characters. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, born in 1807, Emily in 1830. Harriet Beecher Stowe, born in 1811, Emily Dickinson in 1830. She was the one who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was so impactful and important in giving the reason why a civil war needed to be fought when no other option seemed to be working. Walt Whitman, born in 1819, again, Emily Dickinson in 1830. All of these people lived right through the entire 19th century. Another one, Edgar Allan Poe, born in 1809, died in 1849. He, like Emily Dickinson, had a shorter lifespan. Those were her contemporaries. So then, let me just take a moment to check in with you and just ask anything in that large framing so you can find Emily Dickinson tucked inside sort of the historical flow and in the trajectory of the American consciousness. Is there anything you want to observe or something you know that I didn't know and you said, actually, you got that wrong, Rick? It was really like this or whatever. Is there anything you want to offer here? I'll just pause and check in before we get our first poem and start to hear her voice. And Mary can bring you in if you have anything to observe.
Go ahead, Pierre.
Yeah, I would just say, Rick, that was fabulously enlightening. Thank you so much for contextualizing everything in such a wonderful way.
You're welcome, Pierre. Thank you. Thank you. Did you notice, Pierre, when we put it this way, how very young our country is?
Absolutely.
I mean, if I did that to something like England, it would take forever. There was so many things to cover. America, we're still so young. And it can be a consolation because if there's a time, certainly not now, when we're just acting so darn immature, well, you can say we're kind of young. So there can be a consolation, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah. Any other comments?
Melville was an important contemporary too.
Ah, thank you, Hermit. Yeah. You know, any comment about him you want to make? He wrote a little book. Yeah.
Well, he was also important in the reform movement. He helped stop the beating of sailors and on the ships and things like that with his writing. So he was important for the reform movement.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, Billy Budd, Moby Dick, of course. We know that when Frederick Douglass went to Bedford to work in the shipyards, he almost certainly was there at the same time as Herman Melville was there on the ships. It was one of the great seaports of the world was Bedford. Thank you, Mary. Anyone else? Well then, since you're so completely satisfied, let's just take a moment and listen to some poems. Before I do it, I want to pop something up on the screen here. And I'm going to share the screen, Mary, okay? There we go. You guys see that? That is an example. That is a manuscript of Emily Dickinson. So Emily Dickinson, as we're going to find out, lived what we call a reclusive life. And when we say that, we think of someone just hidden away and, dark room, hiding, narrow world, that kind of a thing. Okay, something turned off and then turned on again. Okay, we think of a recluse because she mostly lived her life in the room in her house. And it's created quite a mystery about what caused her to do that. Why did she do that? Well, we have to be careful with the words and not just what they mean, but what they connote, what they seem to suggest about a shrunken woman who had no relationships and dwelt in her room and never came out. No, this was a vastly perceptive woman, fierce, scarily bright. And she dwelt in a house of meaning that few of us could bear living in. It was filled with perception and beautiful, careful poems written. This manuscript that you see in front of you on the screen gives you a sense of how she thought the poems completely out in her mind and simply wrote them out with rarely a correction. So it reminds us of Mozart. When people look at the manuscripts of Mozart and these highly complex symphonies or quartets or whatever they are, one of the things that amazes people looking at them is they came out perfect. No mistakes, no corrections. How does that happen? So on this particular manuscript of Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant, which is the eponymous poem for this whole series, the Faber Sessions 9, number 3, is as you look there, she only has one thing she was unsure about. Right there in the middle, you see where she has two words and she can't decide. Bright, too bright, or too good. She's unsure. Just wanted you to see that, to just be amazed. Okay, am I back now with, okay, very good. Okay. Now, the house that I was referring to, let me just give you a quick share of the screen so you can frame it in your imagination. There's her house. There's bricks there that have been painted, bricks and wood. And that was the house she lived most of her life in. The mystery of this, we'll talk about a little bit later. But her biography is so hidden, and perhaps purposely hidden, that we shouldn't spend a lot of time investigating something she doesn't want to share. In other words, pay attention to what she has given. But then let's be clear about something. No one really knew the extent of Emily Dickinson's gift. Why? Because she didn't share it much. There was no publication of her poetry. She sent poems or pieces of poetic lines to pieces of poetry to her friends in letters, and she kept a good, extensive correspondence. But there were only 10 published poems that were out there that had appeared in a newspaper, an abolitionist newspaper or something like that. Only 10. And when she died, she asked her sister, just as she was dying, please destroy all my work. Jared Manley Hopkins had asked the same thing, destroy it all. Why? Because people of such extraordinary capacity, blessed with a gift, oh, people don't understand. Great gifts come at a price. And the price is a person realizes how very small he or she is in relation to the gift they've been given. It can be a crushing experience. And so to labor to try to express or give a gift that's so much bigger and so much more beautiful than he or she is, and realize it's always insufficient, it takes great courage to keep giving and working the gift and trusting that it must be, I must have been given this for some reason. And I hope it works out there. I hope it goes somewhere. But they don't know. So as hard as they work on their relation to the gift they've been given, they don't esteem what they did more than the gift that they're working to give. You see what I'm saying? So no one knew she had poems. And it was her sister after her death that was rummaging through her room to find stuff and found out she'd written 1,800 poems. It was a treasure trove of what would become one of the two greatest poetic gifts in the American scene. She and Walt Whitman are traditionally associated with the distinctive American voice. You have to get that part around Emily Dickinson and the gift. Those blessed with great gifts have to struggle with how small they feel in relation to the gift. This you hear in the great mystics. You hear it in St. Paul. He's overwhelmed by the beauty that was entrusted to him to give to the world. And everything he said, it was inadequate. But for us, we say, oh my God, inadequate? Are you kidding me? An incredible, beautiful. Thank you for writing what you did. You expressed that so beautifully. And they're grateful, but they say it's not even close to what is the real thing, the gift, capital G. You have to get that in order to understand Emily Dickinson and why she resisted the religion of her day. She was born smack in the middle of evangelical Calvinism, Puritanism. It was all around her. And the Great Awakening, as it was called, was that Puritan awakening that was happening in the colonies in New England, all around her, affected everybody. Amherst College was founded to support the evangelical Puritanism. What was exactly that religious context so that you can hear enough to understand why Emily Dickinson was the only one in her family to refuse conversion to Christ? She was not refusing God. She was not refusing Christ. She was refusing what her religion was doing with that, and how narrowly it shrunk the gift down into a manageable, controllable structure that you had to go inside of and stay there. And as long as you stayed there, you were a good Christian. And everything inside of her was saying, too small, not sufficient for the gift. Now, remember, for a person of such a gift to say this is not to say that everyone is supposed to leave the box. No, it's just that she was unable to get in the box without feeling herself stripped of the gift that she was given and entrusted with, that she spent her life trying to discover. See what I'm saying? If you interviewed, if it had a voice and could talk to you, a quartet by Mozart, it might feel an enormous resistance to having to be sent through a violin or a flute. Those things are so tiny. And how can I get all in there without losing the beauty I'm bringing to the instrument? See what I'm saying? I'm trying to analogize for you to catch something of her consciousness. Let me give you a sense of the Calvinism that was around her, which in America was called Puritanism, with additions and modifications. It had to do with how people are saved. Let's put it that way. And it had to do, it's rooted in a certain insight of St. Augustine in an argument he had with one of the greatest theologians Britain ever gave to the world. And that was a theologian by the name of Pelagius, who lived at the time of St. Augustine, the late 300s and the early 400s, early Christianity period. It had to do with Pelagius, a truly great heresy. So there's greatness in this heresy. Everyone has to fight their way through what Pelagius says. The greatness was this: it seems absolutely appropriate that for us to receive salvation, we must want it. And the way we express our wanting is not passively, but by actively willing that the gift be given us. Well, there's a part of that sounds really good, right? Yes. A cooperative willingness to receive a gift. But it doesn't take much to slip into, I caused that gift to be given me because I deserved it. You hear the slippage? Lethal. It's devastating. And it's Augustine, it took a man of his stature to fight so great a fight to defeat the power of Pelagius's ideas. That I earn the gift of God. I'm that significant in the gaining of my redemption. I have to want it for it to be given. And Augustine says it just isn't that way. The gift was given before we asked for it, before we even knew it was around. And our desire for it is already the gift working in us. So he's saying redemption is a response to something already given, an initiative of God first to love us through our parents who caused us to be born into the world, a church that existed before we got here, that was passed on to us through the waters of baptism, and we hope the good example of those who call themselves Christian, inspiring us, causing us to want what is greater than ourselves. Okay. Calvinism had a very Pelagian feel to it. 5 aspects to it, and then I'm done with that, and we'll hear a poem. The 5 points of Calvinism, or Puritanism as it's called in this country, just like Anglicanism is Anglicanism, that's what it's called in England, Church of England. In the United States, it's called Episcopalian. 2 different names. Calvinism or Puritanism had 5 aspects. First one, total depravity. That people, all of us, are born. Depravity is a tough word because it sounds like we're morally perverse from the start. Well, you had a tendency to think that way, but it really means just total inability. We have no ability. The gift of God is his choice alone, whether he gives it or not. Total inability of humans. Second, unconditional election. It was the Puritan understanding that God picked certain people out to be saved, and he picked other people to be damned. Wow. Well, there you go. I wonder which one I got, what ticket I got. Why would someone say something that sounds so monstrous? Well, it's possible for us to look at certain people who just, if you will, go bad. And we can't figure out why they seem to be bad to the bone. It's a way of trying to frame why are there good people and why are there bad people. And it's a puzzle. It wasn't a puzzle to Calvin. It's because God made it that way. Problematic to me, but there you go. Calvin was a brilliant man. But even brilliant people don't get it all right. Total inability. Number 2, unconditional election. God chooses whom he wishes. Number 3, limited atonement. God redeems from sin for his own reasons, and only the people he chooses to redeem. And it seems like God doesn't choose to redeem everybody. So there you go. Number 4, irresistible grace. Those who have been chosen by God and redeemed by God, remember that select group, of which Puritans hoped they were the select group, that the grace of God working in them will always be greater than their worst day. A chosen one can sin badly, but it will never be so bad as to cause them to fall into the other group. Last of all, the perseverance of the saints. It had to do with a strong moral imperative that those who knew that they were part of the chosen group, not the unchosen group, the saved group versus the unsaved group, that they act like they've been saved, that they persevere in being a Christian grace in the world. Calvinism, Puritanism, as it was happening around Emily Dickinson, if you read some of her poetry and hear it as we're just about to do, you can see how suffocating this spirit would be having to enter that box and say that's what conversion meant. She just said, I cannot do it. Again, she wasn't against God. It penetrates her poems. She wasn't against God's gifts in the world. She noticed them, cared for them. But she had a real problem, just like Frederick Douglass did, by the insufficiency of the religious teaching that people seem content to live inside of. that seemed to her to leave so much out that needed to be included. Okay. Before I take a poem, any comment? Anything that you think might help, an insight you have? Well then,
Oh, I could mention something. Mary's husband, Eddie.
hey, Eddie. Yeah.
Hello. Uh, I was struck by her femininity, the gentleness and gentility in her, in what she did, and the sort of enjoying the blanket, the warm blanket of just, well, I can't think of a better word than niceness, but I guess that doesn't sound right. That exists in the world as well as, you know, other things, and that she thought it was worth calling attention to that, because that's the way she felt it. Evidently, a lot of the time was not the harshness exactly, which is there if you look for it, but the underlying just goodness that exists in the world, and she was celebrating that and acknowledging it,
Yeah.
and sort of reveling in it.
Yes. Eddie, thank you. Where did you get to be so smart? Just amazing.
That's my wife. She'll debate that.
Well, your wife was looking so proud of you there. You actually get to a very good point. We're going to see here that one of her resistances to the religious structure into which she was expected to enter, and which she refused, was its world-denying quality. A Calvinist mindset. It was probably more connected with John Calvin's own personality. And sometimes the personality of a founder will imbue his or her greatest teaching with a kind of atmosphere of their own personal struggle and their personality. John Calvin was suspicious of humans and assumed that if you let them get too free, they're going to make a mess of things. And so there was a kind of world-denying quality that was required to be a good Puritan. You couldn't dance. You couldn't drink. You couldn't be frivolous with jokes and laughter. You needed to be serious. The world was a serious place. And if you're not careful, you're going to fall. Things like that. Is there insight in there? Yes. There's some good insight about the way we make a mess of things. But creating a comprehensive viewpoint around worries like that is to lose access to the gift that God gave us to enjoy, to learn from, to be filled with wonder about. And this, Eddie, I think is what you were driving at. She had a great delight in the first gift, what I call the first gift, which is the created world. There was so much there to learn from and to be enjoyed. In this regard, she's a lot like Mary Oliver in our contemporary time, who now lives in heaven with Emily. They have a nice hut on a lake somewhere up there in heaven. I'd like to read with you a poem so that we begin to hear her voice. And then after we have read this and made some comments about it, we can take our pause or coming back. This is a poem called, well, she didn't give titles. So when the editors, especially Franklin, the great editor of modern contemporary editor of all her poems, the great world authority on her manuscripts and what is the proper version of her poems. Her poems are usually labeled by a number that was given in the Franklin numbering of all the poems and by the first line of the poem. A lot of poems are named that way. They just take the first line. And the first line of this one is, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read it to you so that you can hear it. And then we'll see what you noticed. I'll ask you. What, and please, oh goodness gracious, Emily, would not be happy if the question you ask of the poem, well, what does it mean? No, that's not what a poem is about. A poem is about what it enables you to see that you didn't notice, to feel that you hadn't felt before. A change of perception that opens a way. A poem is supposed to activate, it's supposed to evoke and provoke you. So allow it to provoke you. And just all you have to do is notice where you got provoked or something caught you by surprise. And then if you share a little bit of that, we get a sense of how it was heard in our group here. Okay, here we go. Her poems are short, so you got to be ready for them. Tell all the truth. Really? All of it? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight. The truth's suburb surprise, as lightning to the children eased with explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. When Mary sent out her notice today, by the way, she sent a copy of the poem so that you could have them in front of you if you wanted to look at them. But in case you didn't, I'll pop mine up here. See if I've got the right one there. Yeah. How did it provoke you? Anything strike you?
Hi, the thing that, just coming from a news background, hearing somebody say, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Thinking, in our modern day age, when we say slant, there's a grain of truth in everything, right? But there's a slant to it. So that's not all the truth. So for me, that's what hits me.
Thank you. So this is spoken by someone who is a professional news person, big part of her life. So a slanted story is one that is being manipulated instead of telling the truth. You're running an agenda. Did I say that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So great observation. Anyone else? That's all we're doing, just collecting here. How did it provoke you?
I think my provocation was the opposite of that. In that the idea that when we think we hold the truth directly, we reduce it, and her idea that maybe we can only sneak up on the truth lest it burn us or dazzle us too harshly.
Mm.
But there's something about an oblique approach for little creatures to the giantness of truth that might be safer and more beautiful and actually more true.
Thank you. So in you, Shirley thinking slant in the sense of a slanted story, because it's her profession, what she was very attuned to. You as an artist, you see, instead of a slanted story, perhaps you see an inclined plane, and that you have to approach the truth through a journey towards it, climbing to it.
Mhm.
Okay. Any other comment? We'll ask one more before we just take a look at it.
Well, I like that line that the truth must dazzle gradually.
Mhm.
And well, that's something because I mean, during the day, you're just bombarded with a lot of good things just touching the table or the glassware that you're drinking from. There's just some pleasure in that. And but so far as a revelation that comes out of that, it only comes gradually that you realize this is pretty good. I mean, we, it's as if maybe we're here to be tested or, some other thing, but yet there's always a marker toward the other side, the better side, and it's there constantly. And you just have to become aware of it. And when you do, you see that there's a sort of guidance of being pushed to something better than the harsh parts of the world that the world has to offer. And it's just so pleasing that it becomes, the more you think about it, the more irresistible it becomes.
Thank you. See, you let the poem activate you and cause you to think.
Makes a speech, Jack Nicholson.
Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. So let me just make some comments since we're almost at our pause, and I'm just going to just make, not comprehensively comment, but a few things just to leave you thinking as you go get your Hostess Twinkie in the break. Emily Dickinson is living in a time, as I told you, of tremendous change in this country. There was expansion, there was encounter with native cultures, there was death and danger, there was the natural world that went on and on, fields of amber fields of grain, there were grass as high as an elephant's eye, buffalo herds so vast you couldn't count them, they would make the earth itself shake when they began to run. Things so huge, and being out in the wilderness, the night sky at night, no lights of cities to take away direct access to the Milky Way coming down upon you. So much was happening, and so much tumult in the human heart around slavery and women's rights. And all of these things, there was so much conflict. And our bloodiest war on this soil. You live in a time where you had to be careful how you told the truth because it was dangerous all around. So you had to find a way, and this is what Emily has looked for in her poetic gift, is how to tell all truth, but in such a way that it's filled and imbued with a kind of courtesy, so that when it comes at people, it's not too much for them to bear. And she calls that courtesy slant. Come gently. It's like, instead of meeting somebody by just walking right up and looking them in the face and say, "Hi, I'm Rick," you give them their space and you sort of sidle up on the side and say, "Well, hello there." But you don't face them down like eye to eye. You just kind of move close and start to interact. Tell all the truth. How do we do that? How can we speak to each other in our American moment and tell all the truth that we with labor has fought to understand. And to be able to say it to someone else gently, skillfully, that doesn't give partial truths. No, tell all of it, but tell it slant. And then she explains what she means. Success in circuit lies. In other words, coming around a truth. So think of a labyrinth, how once you enter a labyrinth in those religious sense, like at the Chartres Cathedral in France, once you find the entrance, you begin to circle. And you will never lose your way as long as you keep walking forward. And what you're after is at the center of the labyrinth. And each time you go around, you're circling the thing you seek, what you love, until eventually you get there. It gives a person time to be ready to receive what lies in the center, which at Chartres is the Virgin Mary holding the child, Jesus. Success in circuit lies. Don't get into people's face and shove the truth down their nose. They'll react. I think she learned this from Christ. She was an avid, close reader of the scriptures. This is God's way. Too bright for our infirm delight. We can't, as someone said in the background, I heard there, the Jack Nicholson movie, you can't handle the truth. That famous scene from All Good, Few Good Men, or whatever that is. It's a good film. People, like Paul says, feed milk toast to those first learning to eat, who don't even have their teeth in yet. They're so young. And then through time, increase the level of nourishment until they can eat meat and other things. In other words, tell it slant, with courtesy, and coming around the truth, but bringing them in to the truth, the whole thing, so that they're circling it. They're on their way. The truth's superb surprise. Truth, when it's told, does not condemn. It startles and amazes us and creates wonder. That's one of the ways you can tell if someone is really telling the truth. If they say they're telling the truth and they're full of bitterness or edge or anger, there's no superb surprise there. There's just threat. There's no beauty or evocation, a calling into wonder. As lightning to the children ease with explanation kind. A child sees the lightning and then bang, the thunder, and they're terrified. What's happened? And they run to their parents and they're crying. They need an explanation kind. They got too much too fast. So you see the parent coming around the child. Oh, dear one, this is what it is. There's nothing to be afraid. And see where we're standing and there's wood and stuff. The lightning can't get us here. Explanation kind. The truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Okay, just enough. There's much in there I have to leave out, but we're going to take a break. It's 7:05. Mary, send us to a break and then we'll come back for another poem.
All right, let's just break for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, come back 7:11. I'll ring my little bell to bring you back. Grab a drink, stand up and stretch your legs, or stay here and we'll be here to chat. We'll see you in just a few minutes.
Great.
Rick, hello, it's Richard.
Hey, Richard.
Hey, Richard.
Oh, there you are. Oh, are you in Nesco? No, you're still in Oklahoma?
Yes.
Well, my gosh, it's much later than it is here.
Mhm.
How are you doing out there, Richard?
We're doing well, but I just wanted to, I'm the person that I was describing to Penny that Jack Nicholson scene in A Few Good Men.
Ah, a few good.
The only actor, in my opinion, that with a single word like juicy fruit can deliver an unforgettable line in a film.
Yeah.
And he absolutely, and it's interesting in your notes, because as you displayed the poem, your notes were there, but I hadn't seen that. And I just thought, this is exactly what he said, the truth. You can't stand the truth or bear the truth or whatever it was.
You
But-
can't handle the truth.
Handle the truth. That was it. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, that I think that yeah, I love this poem, and thank you so much for bringing our attention to it. So
You're welcome, Richard. I'm so happy you were out there. And is your family all gone now?
they left today.
Oh my gosh, so you guys are in the postpartum thing all over again.
I wouldn't describe it as postpartum.
Well, I
Anyway.
hope it was really joyous to have you all there.
It was. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for your hello here. And there's Pat Golding. Looked like she's on Top Gun cockpit there with her headphones on. Hi, Pat. I can't hear you because you're muted, but if you can unmute, I can hear you.
There I am. I
There
like
you
that
are.
poem. I thought that my first read it was sort of say the truth with kindness, but I liked your interpretation better, with a graciousness, with
Courtesy, yes.
come gently toward people. Where I was thinking, just be kind sometimes. You know, sometimes people say things too much too soon, but yeah, the graciousness of it. I like that sort of the gracious when people are ready to hear it. But I also think tell truth with kindness. You know, see the kind part of what somebody did, not just more whole than just, which takes time for people to absorb the whole. But I like that. I really, she used a few words and a few lines to say a lot, which I really like with her work.
That is poetry itself. An enormous amount into a tiny amount of words. So they just explode with meaning and beauty. He's really good at that. Yeah.
Hey, Rick, do you think that when Jesus shifted to parables, he had decided to tell the truth slant?
Absolutely correct. That whole thing in Mark chapter 4, that is exactly right. And Helen Vendler, who's one of the great interpreters, poetic interpreters of our age, she's really, really good. She had a whole book she did on Dickinson poems. Very, very good reader, close reader, a pleasure to read her. Kind of fierce herself. She's been at Harvard, I think, for forever. And she makes this poem, that poem associated with that Emily Dickinson. How is it that Jesus communicated? I mean, if anyone had all the truth, that he was the truth that God wanted to bring, and how Jesus scared people. He was too dazzling and they were frightened of him. And some wanted to yell, crucify him. He's too uncomfortable. Or as it says in Mark's gospel, very dangerously, it sounds kind of risky. He was altogether too much for them. Or when he goes to his home synagogue and he says, today in your hearing, this is fulfilled. And their reaction? Throw him over a cliff, kill him. It's too bright. And I think what we learned in Mark, since it's chapter 4, is one of the gifts of Christ is learning how he learned things. We always think it's the teaching. Yeah, the teaching is important. But but how did he learn what he taught is an essential part of the gospel. Watch when and how he learned what he learned. And I think when he started his ministry, he wasn't very good at it. He came on too strong. And he had to learn how, like any teacher, not to say too much, not to overwhelm, but to learn your way, kind of your method of being able to read and get a feel with people so that you're always pushing them beyond their grasp. You want that. So they're always having to stretch, but you don't want to overwhelm.
Mhm.
So
I've
parables.
also wondered if the other dimension of slant isn't that what he was trying to communicate was so different than what anybody had ever heard of, that his very nature could only be like snuck up on,
Yeah, yeah,
like teased out, as opposed to just stated.
yeah, exactly. So he both reveals and hides, just like you and I do with people. You
Yeah.
reveal and hide depending on whom we are speaking to and how we are doing that. Did you know that another meaning of slant that came in the same century that Emily Dickinson lived in meant a gentle breeze? I think it had to do with how wind came in through cracks. It was called a slant.
Yeah.
And so to tell all the truth, but tell it slant, I immediately think of Elijah on the mountain. God was not in the storm. God was not in the earthquake. God was in the gentle breeze. Speak as a gentle breeze. Beautiful. It's a poem about her craft and what she's trying, how she understands what she's doing in her craft. Okay,
All right.
now
We
I have,
continued on in a way, but now we'll officially continue on.
okay. Oh, so many things to do. Let me do this one then. I'd like to read to you poem number 466 in the Franklin numbering. It's a poem called I Dwell in Possibility. So let me read it to you first so that you hear it. Allow it to enter your ear without resistance. And just see what it activates. I dwell in possibility. I dwell in possibility. A fairer house than prose. More numerous of windows, superior for doors. Of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Just in that stanza, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. There's something about that. I'm commenting now. That's the musicality is so lovely that you might not understand a single thing she just said, but you still like it. Part of the beauty of poetry. Next stanza. Of visitors, the fairest. For occupation, this. The spreading wide of my narrow hands to gather paradise. That's it. This is classic Emily Dickinson. Very short and just stunning. Now, I've already told you you have to like it, and you might not have liked it. So there you go. I'm sorry about that. Any reactions to what you just heard? What did it provoke?
I would just say absolutely beautiful and resplendent with hope.
Ah, Hope. My gosh, Pierre, it is a major theme in Emily Dickinson, hope. Even though she, in the integrity and her struggle with the religious Puritanism that was around her, and eventually her refusal to enter that world, be like everyone else, and be in that box, it still unsettled her because she knew God was real and she was afraid, would he know me because I'm not in the right place, because I'm not over there in that structure, in that box. And if I'm not there, remember, she's from a theological frame where God chooses some and rejects the others. We don't know why. So she's afraid, by rejecting the box, will he reject her or even notice she's there? So hope is constant in her poems. That you pick that up is fascinating to me. Anyone else?
Is there a comparison between the windows and the doors being the negative? Because I really love what she's talking about with the windows, because I like to see windows and openings and new avenues, and doors to me can be so. So I don't know what she meant by the doors. Maybe I had that wrong.
Wait a minute. Don't you dare do that, Shirley. So when you hear a poem, don't monitor your reaction. Blah, blah, blah. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. Blah, blah, blah. No, I don't. I probably shouldn't. Try not to do that. Just let it work in you. And then remain puzzled if you're not sure. Just stay there is part of how a poem is supposed to work. So thank you for saying, I love that, but I react to it and I'm not sure why it activated me there. Let me just pause there, even though there are other comments, but because we always have too little time. But let me just open this one just a little bit. She's now going to talk again about her poetic craft. You can see I picked these two so that you could not only hear her voice, but hear how she understands what she's trying to do in all the poems she has written. She says, I dwell in possibility. Possibility is the word she uses, replaces for the word poetry. Because poetry is a language of infinite possibility. Because poetry serves the great mystery of all created things. When I say mystery, I'm not talking about riddle. So a riddle is a bedeviling thing that all you have to do is find the clue and you solve the riddle. Mystery is not a riddle. Mystery is like a forest that is so big, open at every point, go in any place you like. And the deeper you go in the forest, the more there is, and the more it gives, the vaster it becomes. I dwell in possibility. We might say, I serve the mystery. I don't want to solve the mystery, because you don't solve a mystery. You simply walk in the mystery and let it change you. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose. explanatory prose. Say what you mean. Get your topic sentenced. Give evidence to your arguments. There's a reason for prose. There's a value to it. But prose, read so many theology books, for God's sakes, they just gut it of mystery and explain everything. How do you write a prose book that never loses contact with the mystery that's infinite and vastly more than we are? She's saying, I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows. Now remember, windows they're a barrier. They're a something. But they're a hole in an impenetrable wall, we call it. And you can't see through a wall. But a window allows you to see a much bigger world on the other side of the window. So a window is not only for letting light into the enclosed space, but it's access outward into a world that's so much bigger than the room you're standing in. Isn't that beautiful? So Shirley, do you see what we're doing here? The choice of a single word resonates with those meanings simultaneously. That's part of the power of a poem, in the exact choice of word. Superior for doors. Now you say, when you think of door, you think of a closed door. Interesting. Not an open door. Huh, interesting. Yes, doors do close. So they take, if you will, a window and turn it into a wall. But I think what she means by doors is not the panel that can either shut the window, the opening, or open the opening. She's talking about the liminal space, the crossing over space, the threshold by which one world, the inside world, meets the outside world, or the outside world comes and meets you at your door. The door is the crossing place between worlds. And that's what a poem is. Get an idea of what I'm saying? Wish I could.
That's so good.
Isn't that awesome how that works?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Now, of chambers as the cedars. So when we say chamber, that sounds like that's a higher kind of formal language. When we say a chamber, it sort of evokes an enclosed, secret, possibly sacred space, a chamber. She used the word room, it just isn't suggestive. So a chamber, of chambers as the cedars, and the cedars she means are the biblical cedars of Lebanon. They're the enduring, everlasting trees that were huge in the first growth forests that they knew in Lebanon. And it was such a valued wood because it came from trees that roots went way beyond seeing. They were powerful, strong. They were fragrant in the warm air. And they were the most admired wood for building things, ships and masts. The great temple of Jerusalem was built of the cedar of Lebanon. So she's talking about her poems as creating chambers made like sacred rooms, like in the temple where God dwells, using biblical imagery, made of the everlasting cedar of Lebanon, impregnable of eye, of chambers that deny access. So she's saying, I want my poems to invite you in, but remember the truth that I am trying to serve here. You have to earn it. You have to be ready for it. You can't just invade the room and sort of walk in. So she uses impregnable. which means unable to be breached. So something of the reality that the poem is offering you contact with needs to meet you and bring you in. A person can't force him or herself in there to that room of meaning and beauty. And for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. My gosh, that's so beautiful. She's talking, prose is like a built structure, paragraph structure, chapters, topic sentences, arguments, all of that. Just everything is organized that way so that you control the meaning and say exactly what you mean. This she describes like the religious consciousness that was around her, that they said, you've got to give yourself to that, and she couldn't. Everything was controlled and the mystery stripped. Everything was explained. Nothing provoked or evoked or creating awe and wonder. No, everything was written out and explained. She's saying that's not what she's doing, and that's not what she serves. To be in a prose world is like a room that has a roof, a gambrel roof. A gambrel roof has a roof like this. So it's not a flat roof, and it's not a pointed roof. I hope you see the signals I'm making on the screen. But it's one, you've seen them around town, in the towns you've lived in, where there's a peak and it comes down at an angle like that, and then it breaks and then comes more steeply down. So it creates that up, neat, neat, neat. It's a gambrel roof. She's saying to dwell in prose, because it leaves out mystery, it explains everything, is like living in a room with a roof that keeps you from seeing the sky and the night and the stars and the Milky Way and everything the Hubble Space Telescope has taught us. Everything that our cities blank out by too much lightness, electric lights. We cannot see the beauty of the night sky as a regular nightly experience of awe. It's like being forced in prose to live inside a closed box and you can't see out. Isn't that something? How she's critiquing prose, but she does it with such beautiful language. Mary just told me that we have a minute to go, so let me just make my last comment in the third stanza. Of visitors, the fairest, if you build a house of poetry, beauty will come because there's space for beauty to fit without needing to be explained and reduced to this is what this means, and this is what this means, and this is what this means. Leave it alone. Create poems that allow beauty to stay mysterious, to stay surprising, unexpected. She says, this is what I seek. For occupation, for me, this. The spreading wide of my narrow hands to gather paradise. Oh. Give me a moment. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you, Father Ganz, and thank you all for being here with us on this Easter Monday. It's great to see you all there and to know the rest of you there, even if we can't see you. Our next Faber Sessions on poetry will be the second Monday of May, which is May 8th. And that will be Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was mentioned a bit here. And so, of course, we'll send reminders, but that will be our next gathering around poetry. And between now and then, we'll have our night school, which is always the last Tuesday of the month. So that will be coming up in a couple weeks on April 25th, with our special guest there being Jane Jacobs. And she was very influential in city planning around community. And so that's something very relevant in our day and time in our cities. And so that will be here in Portland in person, but also with the live stream option for all of you who are outside of the city. And finally, next month, we also have our Mother's Retreat coming up on a Saturday in May 13th. And that's led by Tara Ludwig of the Faber Institute. And it's always a wonderful gathering of mothers of all ages and stages of life. And so just wanted to let you know about those upcoming gatherings. Of course, I'll send out a follow-up email tomorrow with some additional resources, some of these other things I've mentioned. And it's just so great to have you here. Feel free to unmute and say goodbye as you leave. Have a wonderful rest of your evening and week. Good night.